Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's Halloween special. I've got something a little bit different this time. This is actually a piece that I have written, so if you're wondering why the quality has dipped, that's probably why. Based heavily on the legend of the Toronto Island Lighthouse, and I do wish to emphasize, based on. What you're hearing in this story is not 100% accurate to the historic record. And if that sort of thing interests you, I do urge you to seek out some sources to find out the real story. I'll even put a link in the description to a blog post that details it very, very well. But I just wanted to emphasize that this is based on the events. It is not a 100% accurate retelling of them. It's always a good idea to take folklore and legends with a pinch of salt and seek out other sources later if it interests you. And I urge you to do that with a lot of the sort of urban legend, ghost story stuff you come across, because that in of itself can actually be quite interesting. This one is going to be a little bit graphic. It is unavoidable, I'm afraid. So as per my usual warnings, if that's not something that's not really your cup of tea, feel free to find another scary story to listen to. I would like to apologize in advance for the few misspeakings that you're going to hear. And yeah, just enjoy, let me know what you think, and what else? Any other warnings? Yeah, just the usual stuff. It might be a bit gory. It might not quite be to everybody's taste with modern worldviews, but it is just a story. So if it doesn't sound like it's for you, feel free to move on. Otherwise, please hang around and enjoy one of, if not the most famous piece of Toronto folklore. I hope you enjoy it, everyone. The only sound in the building was the whisper of the broom as it scratched across the old wooden floor. The caretaker didn't normally work this late, but a memo had come through from the historic board. The old lighthouse was due for some sort of inspection by city bigwigs in the morning. Something about the next steps on the road map for change. The caretaker thought it was a bunch of municipal gibberish, but it did mean a late night of battling dirt and cobwebs in time for fancy men in suits to strut around while pointing at things and pretending that they knew what they were doing. He would rather be home in his comfortable apartment with a hot dinner. Still, work was work, and the caretaker wasn't fussy. A few hours of extra pay was worth the trouble, and of course the general creepiness of the old lighthouse at Gibraltar Point. He bent his head to his work and tried not to let his mind drift to the old stories. He told himself that he was a sensible man, and besides, he'd worked over here on the island for many years and had never seen or heard anything. The only strange happenings he'd ever really been a part of had been revealed to be the actions of mischievous and unsupervised school children. Even so, alone in the dark, with only the weak light from his battered old miner's lamp, the caretaker was uneasy. Legends and superstitions were easy to ignore in the bright of daylight, less so when the shadows begin to stretch and swallow everything around you. Despite his best efforts, the caretaker couldn't help but think about poor old Radelmuller and his grisly end. Even if you didn't believe the more lurid details, the fact that the lighthouse keeper met an untimely and tragic end was borne out by the historic record. Unease growing, the caretaker picked up his lamp with its anemic rays of light and began to climb the stairs, sweeping as he went. As he ascended, he noticed the air seemed to grow thicker somehow, with a sort of heavy, oppressive feeling, as if from anger. Goose flesh rose on his arms and the hairs on his neck stood at attention. It almost felt like he was being watched by some malevolent, angry force. Peering around in the gloom, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Chiding himself for being silly and letting superstition get to him, the caretaker reminded himself that, in all likelihood, he was being ridiculous. He forced away the creepy feeling that had settled into the back of his mind, or at least he tried to, as he continued to sweep. All was quiet in the Toronto Island Lighthouse. Suddenly, the caretaker almost jumped out of his skin as a strange tapping echoed from the lighthouse tower above him. Heart racing, he almost dropped his broom. Taking a deep breath, he remembered the old oak tree outside. The branches were obviously knocking against the old building because of the January wind. As he stood waiting for his heartbeat to slow, he tried to force himself into a calmer headspace. The effort proved futile, though, as he heard another noise rising around him. He strained to hear it, but it sounded almost like a low groan, as if someone was in pain. But the caretaker knew that he was the only person in the building. In fact, he was probably the only person on this part of the island. Again, he thought of Radelmuller, who had been the first lighthouse keeper posted to the lighthouse at Gibraltar Point back in the early 19th century. Back when Toronto was still called York, back before the islands themselves even existed, the land still being a peninsula with the one harbor entrance. The posting to the lighthouse almost seemed like a step down for a man who had once served the Prince of Wales, but Radelmuller had encountered a few difficulties during his time in North America. The job as a lighthouse keeper had been taken out of necessity. It was at least a home and pay, even if it was difficult to support his wife and daughter. At least they were free to stay with friends in town and not have to face the isolation of the lighthouse that jutted up from the landscape like an old tooth. During his lonely watches, Radelmuller often thought about how the lights of York glinted so weakly and so insignificant in the surrounding wilderness, though they were often his only company. Recently, Radelmuller's mood had been better. He'd found a way to supplement his government pay. Being of Bavarian origin, he did know how to make beer. He was quite good at it, if he said so himself, and luckily there was a ready market for it, just across the harbor mouth where the soldiers were stationed at Fort York, and they were more than happy to buy his product. The caretaker knew all of this, and deep down he actually sympathized with Radelmuller as a fellow underpaid government worker. The only thing the caretaker didn't hold with was Radelmuller's decision to squeeze more money from his customers by watering down the beer. Radelmuller himself was a bit ashamed of this choice. Soldiers also received little pay in exchange for difficult lives, but in the end, the desire for a better life for his family won out. By that fateful night in January of 1815, the lighthouse keeper had been through several rounds of his little experiment. Whenever he prepared a barrel for sale, he watered it down just the tiniest bit. Not enough so that you'd notice, just enough to squeeze another penny or so out of each batch he brewed. It had worked well so far. No one had noticed. Besides, as long as it didn't affect the overall strength of the beer, he wasn't really hurting anyone. His customers were still getting a quality product after all. He would finally be able to put away some real money. Unfortunately, that would not be the case, as well the caretaker knew. Standing there in the inky darkness, on the 13th step, with that strange, low groan fading away in the echoes of the lighthouse, he thought of Radelmuller, and was ready to dismiss the story and the strange events so far as being the result of the isolation, darkness, and his overactive imagination. This proved slightly more futile when the sound began again. It was the same low groan. It seemed to creep up the stairs to where the caretaker stood, and surrounding him, it faded away. The caretaker, considering his options, decided it would be best to pick up the pace and be done with his work as soon as possible. He could be soon safe back in the bright lights of Toronto. He began to sweep again, but the motion felt strange and dragging, as if the broom was meeting some resistance. The caretaker looked down and saw a dark stain covering the stair. Under his breath, he cursed, thinking that the historic building had sprung a leak, and he didn't really fancy the idea of having to climb out onto the rickety old roof to find it. But on a second look, the liquid looked thicker, more viscous than water. The caretaker swung the broom around near his face to get a better look at the dark something clinging to the bristles. Gingerly, he touched it and brought his fingers into the pale light of his lamp. There, they shone red. He rubbed the substance between his fingers, and it gave off a very distinct metallic and iron-like smell. With a rushing feeling, the caretaker's mind snapped back to that fateful night in January, all those years ago. It began like any other, with Radelmuller selling a barrel of beer to the soldiers from the fort. This time it was the Glengarry, in their distinctive green uniforms, who had rowed across the unfrozen harbor in a tiny wooden dinghy. John Henry and John Bloman had made the trip that cold and icy night, the little boat rocking precariously over the choppy waters of Lake Ontario. By the time they arrived at the light, both soldiers were red-faced from cold, and made their purchase without even bothering to haggle, which Radelmuller preferred, in their haste to get back to the warmth of their barracks. Radelmuller watched the soldiers disappear in the distance. Bloman and Henry left the barrel outside their barracks room, given how crowded it was in the evenings. They opened the door to the sounds of songs being sung and the click of a dice game. Certainly in the evenings, when the work of the day is done, the life of a soldier could be almost pleasant, and perhaps it seemed even more so after their frigid trek across the water. As the evening wore on, the sounds of good cheer gave way to drunken revelry, and eventually the barrel, being kept outside, was called for. A soldier staggered outside, rolled it in, and heaved it up onto the table with a clatter. Between the ice and the drunkenness of the soldiers, it took a few minutes to knock the top band off and open the barrel, but they did manage. And then stared down in confusion. Where there should have been only beer, there was at least an inch of ice floating on the liquid. The silence gave way to a roar of anger as the soldiers realized the trick. The beer had been watered down. Shouts thundered through the room as the soldiers cursed Radelmuller and his treachery. Why, it was practically treason to treat the king's men in such a fashion. Henry and Bloman were told to get over to the lighthouse and have words with Radelmuller. Neither man relished the thought of another trip in the icy night, but the attitude of their fellow soldiers left no room for argument, and so they trudged back down to the dinghy and headed for the lighthouse. At this point, Radelmuller was inside the lighthouse itself, as his duty dictated, being well into the night. He looked out and noticed the small wooden boat headed towards him across the lake. Figuring the soldiers wanted more beer, he headed downstairs. It didn't take very long for the soldiers to reach the lighthouse, as they were both young and strong. Radelmuller opened the door as he saw them approaching from the lake shore. His apprehension grew when he realized that their faces were not only red from cold, but rage as well. The lighthouse keeper, sensing that his deceit had been discovered, had just enough time to slam the door closed and bolt it tightly. Thankful that he'd had the foresight to purchase a new bolt in the spring. He held back in the darkness, hoping the soldiers would give up when faced with the locked door, but no such luck. There was a tremendous banging as the soldiers demanded that Radelmuller come out and speak with them. Radelmuller had no intention of doing what they demanded and hoped the door would hold. Unfortunately, the brittle wood wasn't strong enough to withstand the assault from the two strong and rather drunk soldiers, and it gave way with a crash. There was nowhere for Radelmuller to go. Henry and Bloemen were between him and the door. All he could do was make a mad dash for the stairs, noticing that the soldiers hadn't been so drunk as to forget their muskets, which were slung across their backs. Henry and Bloemen gave chase, and Radelmuller was caught on the 13th step of the Toronto Island Lighthouse. The soldiers roughly threw him to the ground, and blows began raining down as the lighthouse keeper begged for his life. His cries gradually gave way to gurgles and finally silence as he was struck with the stocks of the soldiers' heavy muskets. And finally, the only sound in the room was a sickening crack as his skull shattered. Fury spent, the soldiers came to their senses. Henry and Bloemen looked down at the crumpled heap that had once been a man and realized what they had done. "What do we do?" said Henry. "We've killed him. We'll be hanged. What do we do?" "Shut up," cut in Bloemen. "Shut up. I know what we'll do. We'll cut him up and hide the pieces. They can't hang us if there's no body, 'cause then there's no evidence." "We can't do that. That's desecrating a body on top of murder." "Well, do you have a better idea?" Henry admitted that he did not. Bloemen pointed out that with the body dismembered, even if a part was found, who was to know that it was from a person at all, and not, say, a butchered animal? The two soldiers began their grisly task, their silence punctuated by the squelching of the meat and the popping of joints and bones as they were separated. They scattered the pieces across the lighthouse property, stuck under rocks and dropped into holes. Henry and Bloemen were left with a puddle of blood on the stairs. They tried to clean it up with the rags scattered around the lighthouse, but made poor work of it. They didn't dare use their own clothing, for fear that it would tie them to the crime. After doing the best job they could, the soldiers headed back to the fort. And that was the last time anybody saw Radelmuller, at least whole and living. In the coming days, both men would be charged with the crime, and although they were both later acquitted, Radelmuller would never see justice for the horrific murder that had been done to him. These thoughts whirled in the caretaker's mind. He knew them all well, the details of the murder, the soldiers that had gotten away, and perhaps most distressing of all, that Radelmuller had never seen justice. If anyone had a right to anger, it was certainly the lighthouse keeper. With the bloody stain, as it seemed to be, seeping over the stairs, he decided that he was done for the night, city inspection or not, and the caretaker steeled himself to walk through the darkness of the building and out to his boat. All of a sudden, the door slammed open with an icy wind, and the hideous groan rose all around him until he could think of nothing else. The caretaker half ran, half staggered outside, looking around wildly, but nothing was amiss. There was no gruesome apparition, no groan, not even any wind, and the grounds were, frankly, quite well lit from the light of the moon. The caretaker shook his head and briefly thought about carrying on his work when he noticed a strange shadow on the periphery of the clearing. He stared, and it seemed to be a man, but the caretaker could see no real features to speak of, no face, no clothing, just the vaguest of shapes. Then the caretaker felt it again. The air came alive and electric with hatred and malevolence. The feeling of being watched washed over him and settled in his stomach like a dead weight, as if the strange shadow was waiting to see what he would do. The caretaker resolved right then to get off the island as quickly as possible. He turned and ran without even bothering to lock the lighthouse door. He ran down the trail to where his own boat waited at the tiny dock. As he ran, the malevolent watching feeling stayed with him, and he did not dare turn around for fear of what might be following him. He burst through the trees onto the lakeshore, his boat in sight. He slid down the embankment and scrambled across the shoreline. In his haste, he slipped and fell, knocking loose several large stones from the dirt. Cursing his luck, he struggled to his feet. Kicking the stones away, he noticed something long and thin sticking up from the ground. It glinted pale and yellowish in the moonlight. The caretaker bent and pulled it up and began to rub at it with the frayed sleeve of his old jacket. He stared in horrified realization at the object in his hand. It was, unmistakably, human. A human jawbone. He looked up and noticed the strange shadow had followed him indeed to the end of the path. As he watched, waiting, the shadow seemed to condense somehow as he was watching it. It grew stronger and less translucent until finally the caretaker was looking at the bloody, battered body of what had once been a man. The thing let out one final strange, shrieking groan, and, as quickly as it had seemed to come, it faded away in the moonlight. The caretaker stood in silence, the horrible noise still ringing in his ears. He looked at the jawbone in his hand, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and walked towards the dock on trembling legs.